I'm going to do something a little different than I typically do on this topic. Usually I do kind of more biblical theological foundation. Matt did that. I really appreciated Matt's job on that. I agreed with everything he said. I might say a couple additional things, but I agreed with everything he said. So the things I'm going to say might sound a little different, might sound a little strange. I'm going to pursue a rabbit trail here. And all of this is a bit tentative. This is probably a bit irresponsible of me to go in this direction. This is the sort of thing that maybe I should write as a paper in college and let my professor tear it up and then come back. But I'm going to do it in front of all of you right now. You ready? The purpose of my remarks is to reflect on one particular challenge for conceiving of and defending religious liberty in our own neo-pagan moment. And that's the challenge of specifying what we mean by religion. And by calling ours a neo-pagan moment, I simply mean that the hegemonic religious perspective in the public square generally, and the commanding heights of culture specifically, government, corporate America, Hollywood, law schools, universities, is no longer Christianity, but a post-Christian paganism characterized by a cult of the body, a worship of sex so profound we fuse it with our identity, and an anti-institutional, spiritual, but not religious pluralistic approach to the transcendent and mystical. If you haven't seen it, you should all get, it's up there, I can't reach it. Stephen Smith's book, excellent book, Pagans and Christians in the City, Cultural Voice from the Tiber to the Potomac, talking about the kind of pagan moment we're in. And religious liberty as an idea or doctrine was originally formulated in a very different historical moment when Christianity in some form was the hegemon. And we've heard about that in the last two talks. The culture wars of Christendom weren't over the nature of marriage or gender, but over justification and the sacraments. One Christian tradition or denomination against another. The doctrine helped, therefore, Baptists and Protestant Catholics live together in Europe, and Baptist Congregationalists, Anglicans, Presbyterians in America. And the earliest formulations of religious liberty, as such, took a shared morality for granted. Religious liberty served, at the risk of slight overstatement, denominational peace. And though it would require considerably more historical research to demonstrate my point, but my sense is that religion in this older context tends to be conceived of institutionally, or as William Cavanaugh puts it, substantively. Emil Durkheim, for instance, offers such a definition. He says, a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. Unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. And I'd add to this beliefs and practices an organizing authority, which declares the boundaries of both beliefs and membership, whether that's a Christian church, a Muslim mosque, a Jewish synagogue, a Buddhist or Hindu temple, and so on, as well as any officers that do the work of such institutions. I think the U.S. Constitution conceives of religion institutionally. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Yet there's another way of conceiving of religion, which is becoming increasingly common in our post-Christian day, and that's giving what Kavanaugh calls a functional definition. He also uses constructivist, but I'm just going to keep it simple at functional. That is to say, religion understood according to the function it plays in someone's life. A functionalist approach to religion allows for a broader range of ideologies and allegiances to qualify as religion, such as nationalism or Marxism or capitalism and so forth. Thus, if a professing Christian, for instance, spends most of her life devoted to the stock market, this is Kavanaugh's illustration, then her functional religion is capitalism. Not metaphorically, but really, he says. Kavanaugh's larger project in making these distinctions is in distinguishing the institutional or substantive from the functional, or you might call it phenomenological version of religion, is to demonstrate that the public square really isn't neutral. It's always religious, at least if we consider religion or conceive of religion more broadly, functionally or phenomenologically, as I said. And I think he's exactly right. The public square is not religiously neutral, at least when we use the word religion in this broader, functional, phenomenological sense. It is, as I've said many times, a battleground of gods. It's just inevitable. I think Luther's definition of a God is helpful here. He says a God is the term for that to which we are to look for all good and in which we are to find refuge in all need. Therefore, to have a God, and he's small g, is nothing else than to trust and believe in that one with your whole heart. Anything on which your heart relies and depends, I say that really is your God. I think Luther might be joined by the atheistic and liberal philosopher Ronald Dworkin, who argues that atheists can be religious too. Now, how's he using the term? Well, he's defining it as a deep, distinct, and comprehensive worldview that governs people's lives. The worldview is a kind of lens through which they see the world. And functionally defined, everyone has such a religion, and all of life is religious. Everyone has God or gods, which is one reason why the first commandment forbids worshiping other gods, right? Living inside our own neo-pagan culture, then, you may have noticed then how common it has become for for preachers and writers, Christians and non, to characterize the supposedly secular public square as quite religious after all. One of a million examples I could give. Journalist Andrew Sullivan has argued that critical theory is a religion, complete with its own orthodoxy, he says, for explaining all of life, a doctrine of sin, focusing on oppression, a call for confession, check your privilege, a doctrine of conversion, get woke, and a call to obedience and collective action. I can give you more examples. And how many pastors and youth pastors have done the same? I've done it in my own writing. After all, a functional definition is grounded in a right anthropology, one which acknowledges that human beings are fundamentally religious. Everyone worships, right? Now, I assume anybody listening to what I've said so far is at least somewhat sympathetic to the utility and the rightness of defining religion functionally, right? We have the first commandment in our Bibles. We all have gods. The trouble is, functionally defining religion creates a challenge for the doctrine of religious liberty, and it's not hard to see. If we're all religious, the Christian and the neo-pagan alike, why would Christians, if we're interested in defending religious liberty, not defend the liberty of neo-pagans to practice their religion, whether that includes same-sex marriage, abortion, or even drag queen story hour, to beat that horse once again? In fact, if our entire lives are indeed religious, and if all of our morality is determined by our religion, shouldn't we feel bound to protect all morality and immorality, at least if we claim to want to defend religious freedom? And the challenge here results from the fact that the doctrine of religious freedom arose, as I said, in the context of Christendom, but we're no longer in that moment. Let me summarize the challenge this way. Our religion places doxological and doctrinal demands on us, as well as moral demands on us. Now, in Christendom, our divisions were over worship and doctrine, not so much morality. Baptists and Congregationalists weren't fighting over same-sex marriage, Catholics and Protestants over abortion. Religious liberty helped us live together in spite of doxological and doctrinal differences. But in a neo-pagan world, a growing number of people, especially those occupying the commanding heights of culture, as I said, reject religion in any institutional or substantive sense, which means not only is their worship different, so is their morality in some very fundamental ways. What's a man? What's a woman? But again, do we really want to consign the whole world of morality to religious differences that should be protected by religious freedom? Or let me put the challenge even a little more crisply. If in a post-Christian moment we feel compelled to define religion functionally, and I think it's good that we do, how can we defend religious liberty when our different religions aren't merely offering different views of the sacraments, but are offering dramatically different moralities? What's the solution? Well, a few years ago, officials in the Obama administration seemed to implicitly recognize the challenge and attempted to resolve it by redefining freedom of religion as freedom of worship. Freedom of worship means we won't impose ourselves on your institutional religious life, what doctrines you believe, what songs you sing in your church, what sermons you preach, or what God you worship inside your church or your home. Now, immediately, conservative Christians called foul because they rightly recognized that this was an attempt to quarantine Christianity to our private institutional religious expressions and leaving its moral claims out of the public square. The irony is, best I can tell, the Obama administration's freedom of worship ends up looking a lot like freedom of religion inside of an 18th century Christendom, when our rivalries weren't moral, but doctrinal, doxological, denominational. The Baptists could say to the Congregationalists, leave us alone inside of our church building and with our tax dollars, and we'll leave you alone. After all, nobody was trying to argue for abortion or same-sex marriage. Just don't interfere with my worship. Now, the question in my mind that might be worth a dissertation by a young scholar is whether our views of what religious freedom protects has actually expanded during the cultural wars, especially over the last 20 years or so. I mean, you guys know the stories. A Christian employer says he doesn't want to provide health insurance that covers abortion. A baker doesn't want to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. A school teacher says she cannot call the student by the student's preferred pronoun. And so all three individuals end up in court. We feel the burden being placed on their faith for these moral reasons. So we argue for religious freedom. But is that really the right argument? Do we really want to say that these moral matters should be left up to conscience? Our faith opposes abortion. It opposes same-sex marriage and transgender identification. We think those first two things at least should be illegal. That is not left to the conscience and treated as matters of religious freedom. In other words, if we're placing such issues into the Christian or the religious freedom bucket, we're implicitly saying that those people should also have the religious freedom to abort and to marry someone of their own sex, right? I think it's best to admit that religious freedom arguments and the way we're using them right now are are sort of a Helm's Deep argument. Orcs have overtaken the land, we're backed into a corner, and for these pragmatic reasons, I'm happy for the good lawyers at ADF and elsewhere to make such arguments. But my guess would be that the historical study would show it's an expanded usage of the argument. And in the long run, I wonder if it'll afford all the protection that we hope. Now, let me take this in a different direction now. What I didn't expect back when the Obama administration touted this idea of freedom of worship was for some Christians to begin arguing against even a liberty of worship by calling for theonomy or some form of it, general equity theonomy or magisterial Protestantism or some formulations of Christian nationalism. To criticize blasphemy or to support the church with tax dollars or to name a nation as Christian or to establish the church in any sense is to work against the freedom of worship, I would argue. It creates first and second class citizens, even if subtly, according to whether or not they adhere to a certain theology. It imposes itself on people's worship. So I have progressives to the left of me stepping on the moral demands of my faith, and Christians to the right of me, if that's where they are, stepping on the theological or doxological demands of my faith. What's the solution? Well, as I said, these are very tentative thoughts, but I wonder if it might be something like this freedom of worship. Let me give you 4 quick reasons. Number 1, a freedom of worship acknowledges that everyone worships some god or gods. It's anthropologically accurate, and it makes sense of a functionalist view of religion in that sense. Number 2, that said, a freedom of worship doesn't aspire to take the whole moral domain, everything in our lives, under the banner of its protection. Every conceivable immorality should not be protected as religious freedom, even though every immorality does root in false religion. Number 3, a freedom of worship will end up looking more like, I think, freedom of religion when religion is institutionally or substantively, not functionally defined. Like, who's the organizing authority? Who gets to say what the doctrines are and what people are in and what people are out? That's the role of the church. And that number 4, I don't have the time to argue it right now, but I believe a freedom of worship might actually come closer to the biblical vision of religious freedom. Last 2 comments. First, I would not, in spite of everything I just said, want to ask Christian lawyers to stop making religious freedom arguments right now in the way that they are doing. We are standing in Helm's Deep. It's a good wall of defense. I do wonder if it's creating classroom problems that may ultimately prove significant. Second comment, the suggestion that the scope of our view of religious freedom may need to constrict slightly is not an argument that Christians should stop trying to influence the public square, or in Matt's term, be politically engaged. We absolutely should keep working for justice and righteousness in the public square, and we should see the government should implement those matters that fall within the government's jurisdiction on all people, not just people who share our faith. To slightly constrict the domain of religious freedom, as I'm wondering if it's necessary, isn't actually a call for less imposition from the saints, but more.